I expected this season to come out later than it did. It's really inconvenient because I was working on Star Wars Rebels, Crimson Empire, and the Knights of the Old Republic critique. Now I've got an even heavier workload. I am somewhat overwhelmed by Star Wars content produced on an industrial level. I haven't even gotten to the Sad Batch yet. In the continuation of the first live-action Star Wars show, Season 3 of The Mandalorian was predicted to underwhelm right off the bat. I saw the trailer. It was nothing but flash and a tease to get you excited. Not to mention that the show probably had to write Gino Carano's character out of the series. I'm not even gonna poke that hornet's nest. But it's safe to say that anything Season 2 achieved, if ever so faint, the bait of Boba Fett undermined it. As we saw in that pathetic excuse for a show, they backtracked heavily on Season 2's ending by having Grogu reunite with Mando after an extremely pitiful amount of time. Seriously, there was no development. You can just tell they can't sacrifice those Baby Yoda toy sales. Make all the money in the world, whatever the cost. I was somewhat looking forward to having The Mandalorian without Grogu. And Grogu was just a puppet that was there to sell toys. I didn't think they'd be that desperate. Whether it was Jon Favreau's idea, or a Disney higher-up forced him to revert back to the old, this sort of shit is why I don't support Disney Star Wars. They are extremely incompetent, and backtrack on anything if the backlash is severe enough. Or they think it'll make more money to just go back to what's safe and established. You wanna know something? It's getting old. The only reason Cobb Vanth is still alive is because his character was received well, so he gets special treatment, and as such, nothing bad can ever happen. I think Disney doesn't understand that what happens to one story affects the other, and that it all forms a symbiote circle. As always, I watched the premiere not expecting much, and well, my low expectations were certainly not exceeded in the slightest. So let's get into The Mandalorian Season 3. And see how much this overrated show dwindles. So the first scene was okay, I guess, although I'm conflicted to describe it as that. Maybe a better term was bleh, which is what I described this entire show as. The armorer is making a helmet for a new recruit. I don't know what the point of this opening is. We already know you're not supposed to take off your helmet once you get it. Anyways, a wild mega crocodile or something appears and starts attacking the Mandalorian clan. The thing is though, the Mandalorians have a tough time trying to take the big boy out. Then Mando shows up in his silver Naboo starfighter. I said in my Bait of Boba Fett review that the Naboo starfighter was one of the few things I liked. It's one of the few things that feels like a reference that isn't forced. It heavily contrasts something like the Millennium Falcon in The Force Awakens with the impression of, remember this thing from the original trilogy? I also thought the starfighter suited Mando as a replacement ship. The only downside is that there isn't much room for bounties, but I presume there's a storage compartment that can barely fit one person maybe. Of course, Mando, because he removed his helmet, is little more than an outcast. Now, him removing his helmet at the Imperial base made sense, but the second time he did so, didn't. Telling Grogu he needs to leave didn't require the removal of his helmet. You know, if it was solely based on him removing his helmet one time in the Imperial base, it would have made more sense. But even then, him keeping his helmet off instead of putting it back on immediately after. Mando always seemed to be a really inconsistent character. Remember when he was ready to gun down Cobb Vanth simply for wearing Mandalorian armor, and then decides to help him with the town's problem? He could have just gunned the dude down and called it a day. But of course this show, with a bunch of filler episodes already, needs to be padded the fuck out. Anyways, back to the present. Mando asks how he can redeem himself for his sins. The armorer says that the only way is to bathe in some water or something underneath the mines of Mandalore. Problem is, the mines no longer exist when the Empire purged the planet. Mando still wants to try though. Like a lot of things in this show, there isn't a lot of depth. While it may not be completely necessary, I've started wondering why that is the only way to redeem yourself and be accepted as a Mandalorian again. Because that doesn't make sense at first glance. It being tradition is a super simplistic explanation. Give some more detail. After all, your show is ridden with filler, and spending some time elaborating on, well, Mandalorian culture in a show called The Mandalorian would make things better, would it not? Of course, it took you until episode 3 of season 1 to even get an explanation for what the Mandalorians are. If you didn't watch the Clone Wars or Rebels, you're left out of the loop. Anyways, Mando is determined to redeem himself. But if you think he's going to go straight to Mandalore, well, you should know better. Because of course, Mando is going on an overly long detour designed to waste your time and again, pad out the plot. Mando and Grogu take a trip to Navarro, which is now a bright, prosperous town. Quick question. What in the hell is the time span of the show? I read an article that said that it's around a few years, and if that's the case, they did a terrible job at conveying it. It feels like these episodes happen relatively back-to-back chronologically, and there's no way anything beyond a year has passed. If the article I read is wrong though, then well, how the hell did Navarro change this much? Rome wasn't built in a day, folks. With that being said, Mando lands, gets out of his ship and walks around. In the center of town, he observes a statue dedicated in memory of IG-11, who was like a fallen hero or something. It's nice that they built this replica, but as we'll soon find out, not all of it is a replica. Apollo Creed greets him and tells him right what we observed. You might be wondering why Mando has returned. Well, it's because he needs a droid to help him navigate the mines of Mandalore. But he doesn't just want any droid, he wants the droid he trusts most, that being IG-11. And since Mando is fussy as fuck, he will only accept the assistance of IG-11. Seriously? I don't understand why he needs a droid necessarily, and why it has to be IG-11. Yeah, he hates droids. But this is a matter of regaining his honor. But of course we get another detour concerning a group of pirates. Basically a group of pirates are causing trouble because they want to drink at the bar, but the bar was converted into a school. This part of the episode is really paper thin because Greef Karga directly tells the pirates that they can have a drink at his office. But the pirates want to drink where the school is, and nowhere else. Why is it everyone in the show is out to pick fights? This all started way back in the first few minutes of the very first episode, when Mando walked in and spilled some other guy's drink. Anyways, the pirates are unwilling to accept a drink that Apollo Creed offers them. So the pirate gang leader tries to kill Apollo Creed and Mando, but ends up getting embarrassed when all his goons are gunned down and he runs away. Then we get the ridiculous part where Mando tries to restore IG-11. Apollo Creed mentions that they recovered some of IG-11, which I'm calling bullshit. IG-11 self-destructed while it was standing on lava. How can IG-11 still be intact? The most I could buy is a few pieces, but that's hardly enough to restore the town hero. So he tries to fix IG-11. And when turned on, IG-11 magically reverts to its original programming and tries to terminate Grogu. It's here where the show takes another detour. Basically, Babu frickin' friends tell Mando that if he wants to restore IG-11, he needs to find a part. You know, this is what I mean when I say The Mandalorian would have worked better as a video game. Because that's what it feels like. So Mando flies out into space and meets the space pirates. The pirate leader looks a lot like Craig with jungle hair almost. Mando outruns the pirates and escapes, so I presume the pirates will be supporting antagonists. Basically video game enemies. God, I hate this episode. Mando then travels to some palace or whatever to meet up with Bo-Katan. Bo-Katan has pretty much given up her ambitions now that Mando is the rightful owner of the dark saber. There's nothing he can do for her, and so he just leaves. And yes, that's the entire first episode. This was a whole load of nothing. If I didn't have a channel, I would have quit watching right away, but I'm determined to finish the season. It's bad news for me that Favreau said that he intends to make a season 4. Thankfully, the next episode picks up the story rather well, but it didn't stay that way come episode 3. In the next episode, titled The Mines of Mandalore, they actually managed to make an enjoyable episode, in which Mando travels to Tatooine to meet that old mechanic lady. Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't they hint at a romance between the mechanic and the Twi'lek representative from the bait of Boba Fett? If that's the case, where the hell is he? Is he just a dropped plot point in the Mandoverse as a whole? At this point, I'm also wondering what's to become of Cobb Vanth, given the writers didn't have the guts to kill him off. Anyways, Mando gets an R5 droid to assist him on his trip to Mandalore. This episode doesn't waste our time, fortunately. In other words, the episode is well paced and actually enjoyable. I especially like the part where Mando sends out R5 to scout out the mines. And they actually manage to build up tension, with the droid in question going out, and the signal is mysteriously lost. And so Mando is forced to investigate with his helmet pressurized. This is a far cry from the episode where Mando left his jetpack behind because plot needed to happen. Although I noticed here, as Season 3 goes on, nothing that happened in Season 2 matters. But before we get into that, after killing some alien cavemen, Mando goes into the ruins of the city of Sundari, I presume, with Grogu, and it's actually nice to see the city in its ruined state. It gives off an eerie vibe to what an abandoned city is like, far from what it was like in the Clone Wars. The atmosphere manages to be really good, and they build up to attacks from random cavemen, after which Mando meets his match with a guy in a mechanical suit who captures him. Mando, of course, gets Grogu to flee and get Bo-Katan. Grogu actually goes back, and they sell the urgency in him making his way to the Naboo starfighter, in which the starfighter flies over to Bo-Katan's place nearby, and it results in her figuring out that something is wrong when Mando isn't there, and she actively goes over to save Mando. Bo-Katan confronts the guy in the mechanical suit, manages to outplay him, picking up the dark saber in the process. When I saw this, I fucking knew that this would be Bo-Katan's right to the dark saber based on technicalities. And it makes Season 2 of The Mandalorian even more pointless. This is topped by the fact that after Mando is freed, he thanks Bo-Katan and all that jazz, and they conveniently find the mines of Mandalore, in which he does what the armorer told him to do and bathes in it. Only problem is, this ain't no kiddie pool, and he falls in. Bo-Katan of course swims down to save him, again, and along the way, she sees a mythical creature in Mandalorian culture or whatever. So overall, this might be the best episode in Season 3. This actually has a story and shit. It kinda sucks that they pretty much resolved 2 conflicts at the end of the previous season so shortly, but this was actually competent for once. Feel free to disagree, but I don't actually have any problems with this honestly. But say goodbye to that in the following episodes. In the first 10 minutes, it picks off where we left off with Mando and Bo-Katan. They take off from Mandalore and they get attacked by the Imperials. And so it's a pretty decent action sequence where they fly around, but unfortunately, Bo-Katan's place gets obliterated and both she and Mando jump into hyperspace to get away. And then, the show takes the biggest detour in the world, to focus on what the New Republic is doing. This feels extremely out of place, because this is called The Mandalorian, aka a show about Din Djarin. This detour basically features Dr. Pershing as the protagonist essentially. Dr. Pershing is reintroduced as giving a speech to the New Republic, renouncing his ways as an Imperial after being pardoned. This whole episode is basically New Republic shit. It is nice to see the government finally, but seriously, what does this have to do with The Mandalorian? Around this point and in future episodes, they hint about how Moff Gideon escaped captivity, which renders his capture at the end of Season 2 essentially pointless, further highlighting how nothing in Season 2 matters. Seriously, it's pretty much as bad as The Last Jedi and how The Rise of Skywalker already made that film pointless. I mean, the whole sequel trilogy was directionless and pointless. Would have been nice to have a plan, guys. Also, I'd like to point out that they're doing the same thing in essentially backtracking instead of moving the story forward. Making the sequel trilogy a bad rip-off of the original trilogy was enough, but to see them repeating the same mistakes over and over again, it's pathetic. People wonder why I don't stop talking about the sequels, and this is why. Disney have proved that they haven't learnt a thing. They continue doing shit like this, and it's getting damn old. What's the point in watching this episode after episode if they're just gonna repeat the same thing over and over again? Dr. Pershing's story can be summed up as him meeting this character, Elia Kane, who is also part of Moff Gideon's Imperial Remnant. Throughout the course of the episode, Pershing is manipulated by Kane, who starts leaving him some biscuits he ate under the Imperial Remnant that he likes. I didn't particularly care about Dr. Pershing, but I suppose suppose they do a decent job building him as a character. We see that he wishes to continue his research on cloning, but the New Republic for all intents and purposes banned it. Kane, of course, convinces him to break the law and continue doing his research in secret. They go over to a Star Destroyer, and Kane sells him out to the Republic.
Betrayal.
In which the Republic assume he's still brainwashed and proceed to use this machine, which, I don't know about you, has to be breaking some kind of ethics. I mean, look at it. They're going to completely alter Pershing's mind, and they leave him unsupervised during all this. To which Kane intensifies the machine on Pershing. To describe all of this probably would have been better received if this was not an episode in The Mandalorian. Just make this a short film set in the Mandoverse that explores the New Republic or whatever. I say this because I thought the stuff with Dr. Pershing was actually pretty decent, but it does not belong in The Mandalorian. It reminds me of the Bad Batch episode, which only had the Bad Batch as a cameo. I should probably continue to watch the Bad Batch at this point to keep myself up to date, but aside from that, let's get on with it. We finally cut back to Mando and Bo-Katan after nearly 40 minutes. Yes, I timed it. Mando goes to the Enclave, in which Mando gives his evidence and is accepted back into the Creed. And Bo-Katan, because she conveniently never took off her helmet past the point of rescuing Mando, in which she also dived into the Mandalorian water or whatever, is offered to join the Creed too. Gee, she never took off her helmet once. This just seems too convenient for the plot to happen. They don't even have Bo-Katan keep her helmet on. This plot point only lasts for like 2 episodes, which again is absolutely pathetic. With that being said, let's get on with the next episode, which is complete filler. In this episode, called The Foundling, we see the Mandalorians dicking around. Nothing about this progresses the overall story. One of the opening moments is just Grogu being cute and trying to encourage toy sales. As I said, I was really looking forward to Season 3 without Grogu. Well, anyways, that kid from episode 1 takes on Grogu in what is essentially the Mandalorian battle circle from KOTOR 2. They face each other with paintball darts or something. For most of the duel, if you could call it that, Grogu is utterly clueless on what to do, until he fucking destroys the other kid at the last minute. Then, since a filler episode's gotta have some sort of conflict, we see the kid being grabbed by some flying reptile. And given now it's revealed this is the son of Paz Vizsla, mostly just a supporting character with a few lines, he doesn't want to harm his son. So instead, they go on their jetpacks for presumably a while, until they run out of fuel. Bo-Katan, meanwhile, tracks the reptile to a nest somewhere on top of a mountain. The only notable part of this episode is the flashback Grogu gets, in which he remembers Order 66 and Operation Nightfall, if it's even still called that in Disney canon. Anyways, Grogu is given top priority for protection, and the episode actually peaks in the surprising guest appearance of Ahmed Best as Caloran. Out of all the things that felt sincere in this whole show, it's this cameo. Granted, it was most likely done with the mindset of Jar Jar Binks was the worst character ever, but at least they gave Ahmed Best another chance at Star Wars. I can also at least say that Caloran isn't a brand new character made to just have Ahmed Best be Grogu's savior. He was on a game show on StarWars.com, which is a weird origin point, but at least he previously existed. In the flashback, Caloran is shown escorting Grogu away from Coruscant, and he's actually quite well utilized as a guest appearance. If there was anything I liked, it was this. But this season, and the last one, seems to overutilize cameos and guest appearances. To sum up this episode, Din Djarin and the gang rescue Paz Vizsla's son, and all is well. And Bo-Katan is honored as a hero for leading the rescue effort, blah blah blah. So what's next? Another damn filler episode that only barely progresses the plot. Remember those pirates from episode 1? Well, basically they invade Navarro and cause chaos. The only point this episode has is for the Mandalorians to resettle on Navarro, which basically makes their abandonment of it in season 1 totally pointless. This isn't even like a triumphant moment where they reclaim their home, because they're fighting pirates, not the Empire who took their home away from them. The reasons the Mandalorians get involved at all to begin with is because a New Republic pilot shows up to request help with the planet of Navarro or whatever. We also get a cameo of Zeb from Rebels, We also get a scene that shows how useless the New Republic is. Considering they were wiped out in The Force Awakens, what exactly am I supposed to think of this faction? Because so far, they seem to be even more inefficient than the Galactic Republic. That's nice. Basically, the triumphs of the OT characters led to this. Who fucking Ray? To sum up this episode, it's essentially the Mandalorians assisting Greef Karga with taking back Navarro, with Paz Vizsla taking out pirates on the ground, and Mando and Bo-Katan taking out the pirates in the sky. Again, none of this is satisfactory, because the pirates had nothing to do with driving the Mandalorians out. The whole thing, as mentioned before, is a waste of time. All that happens is that the Mandalorians have a home on Navarro again, and Bo-Katan is ordered by the armorer for some reason to take her helmet off, and now she's allowed to take it off, because the armorer is feeling like being inclusive to all Mandalorians again. This is so fucking paper thin. The only part about this episode I like is where the New Republic pilot guy investigates where Moff Gideon escaped and finds out that he's somewhere out there. Ugh. I know I'm breezing through these episodes, but as filler episodes, I have little to talk about, so I don't know what to say about them. The next episode is the ultimate proof that Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni hate their audience. You want to know what this episode is about? Well, after an introduction to something that has nothing to do with anything, involving a Mon Calamari and a Quarren who are in love, but have to be separated now, Bo-Katan and Mando go to some planet with a democracy, but for some reason, the government is able to hijack control of their ship. Is it just me, or does this seem iffy within the rules of the universe? Couldn't they just use a tractor beam or something? Anyways, Bo-Katan and Mando are forced into a side quest in order to proceed to meet Death Watch, as it's pretty much the only reason they're here. In this episode, we get the most bizarre cameos and guest appearances I've ever seen in my entire life. We've got Lizzo and Jack Black. What kind of drugs was the person who did the casting on? Yeah, much to the internet's ridicule, Jack Black clapping Lizzo is Disney canon now.
Great Scott!
Oh, don't worry, we'll get to him too, but with that being said, Mando have a banquet with the city's leaders, in which they're told about how the working droids have gone haywire. Something I want to make clear now is that I love Jack Black. For Christ's sake, I just watched the Super Mario movie, which he was in, and thus I recently reviewed. If you'd like to watch that review, click on the link in the top right corner of the screen. But this is just plain silly. I also remember watching one of Jack Black's movies, Gulliver's Travels, which was a critically panned movie released in 2010, which had an over-reliance on pop culture references. And Jack Black has the tiny people he meets put on Star Wars, and passes off the iconic scene with Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker as events from his own life. So wait, in the universe of Gulliver's Travels, did the main character see himself on Disney Plus over a decade later as a Star Wars character? You know what? I'm overthinking it. Mando and Bo-Katan suck up to the job they're given and talk to Christopher Lloyd. You know, I pretty much only remember these characters because of the actors who play them. On top of Jack Black and Lizzo, Christopher Lloyd is also an extremely out-of-place guest appearance. So basically, to sum up this episode because it's filler, Mando and Bo-Katan investigate the droids, Mando kicks a B-2 droid over, the droid runs away, they catch it, the duo go to a droid bar, find out the droids are rigged, and trace it back to Christopher Lloyd, who as it turns out is a separatist.
Great Scott!
Instead of revealing that he's a cartoon like in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, another film I reviewed via a commission, it's just an underwhelming climax where he's knocked out and arrested, and Lizzo exiles him on some moon somewhere. I also wanted to mention how the B-1 battle droid in this episode derives from the voice heard in Star Wars The Clone Wars, instead of the films. I only say this because this is meant to be a live-action Star Wars show. So why doesn't the battle droid sound more like it did in The Phantom Menace and such? Grogu was also sticking around with Lizzo and Jack Black. And with that, that's the filler episode. The episode ends by actually progressing the paper-thin plot by having Mando and Bo-Katan meet Death Watch in the last 5 minutes. Basically, Bo-Katan fights Death Watch's leader to claim ownership over them. And then Mando reveals that Bo-Katan earned the Darksaber because of what happened in episode 2. This Chekhov's gun, as you can tell, is very poorly done. It also feels like a way too easy way for Bo-Katan to claim the Darksaber, given the ending of Mando Season 2, where Mando accidentally became the rightful owner of the Darksaber. So yeah, they managed to be hunky-dory by the end. Is it just me, or does it feel like the stakes are non-existent? I think this might be because Moff Gideon and the Imperial Remnant have not been an active threat. The whole season has pretty much been undoing what happened in Season 2, and it's ridiculous. We're 6 episodes in, and the show has been mostly garbage. I can't believe they tried to hype this shit up. This has been the biggest waste of time I've watched since the Sad Batch. At least now, people are finally starting to realize how talentless these two showrunners are. I suppose it's not surprising, given Jon Favreau reportedly hates George Lucas, so he's got some guts having the nerve to work in the universe he created. You know, I think another reason why Star Wars content nowadays is so terrible, aside from the fact that they get the worst kind of non-fans to make the content, is that all of them are from the same demographic. They're all original trilogy prequel-hating sequel purists. Maybe there'd be something for everyone if we had a mixed bag of creators with different mindsets and ideas. But that would be too logical for Disney Lucasfilm. They've all got to be from the same demographic, don't they? Ugh. Next episode. Since they teased Moff Gideon for the longest time, episode 7 is the episode he finally reappears, and he's revealed in an underwhelming way. We just have Kane contact Gideon through a hologram. I was expecting something more memorable given they were hyping up his return. Moff Gideon, of course, then talks to an Imperial Council, and this is where things get really confusing. On the council includes Gilad Pellaeon from the Thrawn trilogy and Brendel Hux, General Weasley's father. Based on what people have said about The Mandalorian and the novel Star Wars Aftermath, they already retconned what happened to the Imperial Remnant. And based on what I've seen in lore videos, I'm already more confused. Wait, so is Moff Gideon's Imperial Remnant separate from what would become the First Order? Or is it all one and the same? Because I thought the opposite was established. This, to me, looks like they're just making the gap between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens even more convoluted. Again, I could be wrong about something, but this is based on what I've been told from the books. This scene, as far as I can tell, is just name-dropping fan service. And maybe for Moff Gideon to find out that Bo-Katan and Mando have caused a ruckus. So the episode is called The Spies, which is a weird name, because this episode has next to nothing to do with spies, unless you count Elia Kane, but that was in the intro. As always, we've got antics with Grogu, as IG-11 is rebranded as IG-12, and becomes an exoskeleton for Grogu. I thought that was flat out stupid, and only exists to have another Grogu is cute moment from the gullible audience. It's played the fuck out. Bo-Katan and the Mandalorians decide it's their time to retake Mandalore after a long time of it being uninhabited. For the first time in forever, this show actually has a story with a clear direction. Shocker, I know. Anyways, upon landing on Mandalore, they meet some other Mandalorians, who are hungry and were stranded on the planet presumably. I don't have much to say about this, because it just feels like they're throwing in even more Mandalorians, so we can have that artificial feeling of joining forces. Looking at the group, they've got the bare minimum of Mandalorians. I guess they just couldn't hire enough extras. Anyways, Mando has a discussion with Bo-Katan about whatever, I completely forgot, and then they evade a giant creature, which is inconsequential to the episode, so let's just forget about him. The climax has Moff Gideon's Imperial forces ambush the Mandalorians, in which they're then closed in. Someone else observed that he didn't even put guards on both sides, which is a convenient omission for them to escape. Moff Gideon is just a smug shit talker. Blah blah, and demands the Darksaber back, and Bo-Katan refuses to give it back to him. And then shenanigans ensue. Paz Vizsla ends up giving his life for the rest of the Mandalorians,
and it's gone.
And I never found myself caring. You can tell that they killed off Paz Vizsla instead of someone important to sell the point, because they're such pussies. Like, they could have killed the Armorer, or Bo-Katan, but that would be too daring, wouldn't it? It's the classic saying, Nothing ventured, nothing gained. And no, The Last Jedi is not the exception to that. It's literally just a stupid subversion of Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. Not original in the slightest. As you can tell, I've glossed over all the episodes. And that's because what is there to talk about? Everyone agrees that the show is crap, and pretty much undoes everything in Season 2. Was this season rushed, or did they go in without a plan like the sequel trilogy? Who knows, honestly. We've also got what I'm guessing are the precursors to The Last Jedi's Praetorian Guards. I can tell that they're just gonna sell these characters as Black Series action figures. Also, Moff Gideon wants to create a new Dark Trooper army because of course he does. Ugh. This season is terrible. Before we get to the last episode, let's recap. Filler, 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 and filler. The whole show pads things out to waste your fucking time. Is it that hard to come up with a show with enough organic plot to carry an 8 episode per season series? It's not like you need to make 30-40 minute episodes each season or whatever. How can Jon Favreau be planning to make a season 4 of this show? If you trimmed all the fat, this show would be reduced by pretty much 60 or 70%. Anyways, let's just get on with the last episode. It was revealed before its premiere that the episode would be a pissing short 39 minutes, which was a major red flag, and the warning was certainly warranted. This is perhaps the most rushed episode of The Mandalorian ever. This is basically a climax with minimum setup from the last episode and the last episode alone. And as well as that, it mostly concerns spectacle and little else. Let me say firsthand that none of the noteworthy good guys die. Mando beats the shit out of Imperials wearing Beskar, and at best it's minor resistance. The following sequence where he looks for Moff Gideon and fights his way through stuff feels too much like a video game, like a lot of other Filoni shows. Since I should probably just get to the point, Moff Gideon and Mando have a scuffle, as well as Bo-Katan joining in, with Grogu fighting Praetorian Guards. It was laughable that Grogu survived this episode, and how he could hold his own against trained warriors, unless these guards were just volunteers picked off the street, because the episode is rushed, and the build-up is minimum, and the stakes end up being minuscule. There's this part where Mando destroys clones of Moff Gideon, like they introduced something just to close it. Unless this is some sort of setup for the Ahsoka series, but who knows. During the fight with Moff Gideon, the dark saber is destroyed.
And it's gone.
And that was a completely unsatisfactory end to a weapon that's been around since the Clone Wars. They also kill off Moff Gideon without proper build-up when a ship crashes into the general area, and Gideon bursts into flames.
And it's gone.
The pacing felt like it was in the middle of a fight, rather than in the closing stages of a fight. So Moff Gideon's death comes across like any other stormtrooper in this show. It's not earned in the slightest. Also, despite having minimal training, Grogu is able to hold in the fire from all directions, even though Kanan couldn't, even though he had more training. Then they just skip over some time later, with Mando taking Grogu as his adopted son, which I mean, that was pretty much already the case. Mando gets the repairs he needs for IG-11, in which the droid becomes the Marshal of Navarro, and Mando is offered a homestead there for his breaks, and there's an incredibly out-of-place circle-in shot before the episode ends. Yeah, so that's Season 3. Let's recap the problems. Filler, 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 and filler. Filler is supposed to be a last resort, and this season completely wasted our time. They backtracked from Season 2 in the Book of Boba Fett for this? This is disgraceful. I have no other conclusion to reach other than they just gave up. But if they gave up, why the hell are they making a Season 4? What open threads are there? I suppose Ahsoka might introduce something, but that's about it. Why is it the Mandoverse is nothing but an extended advertisement for the next thing? So to rate this season of The Mandalorian, I give it a pitiful 2 out of 10. The only seasons of a show worse than this was Star Wars Resistance, but this may be the 3rd worst I've ever seen. I hated this season, and the only incentive I got is to share my opinion with my audience. So that's that. I JJ Plagiarisms. And until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes?
Under the mountain, a golden fountain. Were you praying at the
StageCraft.